expressionless that she feared to look. She wanted him to speak, yet dreaded his first words. She kissed his hair, his head, his very clothes, murmuring low, inarticulate, and moaning sounds. "Leonard," said she, "Leonard, look up at me! Leonard, look up!" But he only clung the closer, and hid his face the more. "My boy," said she, "what can I do or say? If I tell you never to mind it, that it is nothing, I tell you false. It is a bitter shame and a sorrow that I have drawn down upon you. A shame, Leonard, because of me, your mother. But, Leonard, it is no disgrace or lowering of you in the eyes of God." She spoke now as if she had found the clue which might lead him to rest and strength at last. "Remember that always. Remember that, when the time of trial comes, and it seems a hard and cruel thing that you should be called reproachful names by men, and all for what was no fault of yours. Remember God's pity and God's justice, and though my sin shall have made you an outcast in the world, oh, my child, my child!" She felt him kiss her, as if mutually trying to comfort her. It gave her strength to go on. "Remember, darling of my heart, it is only your own sin that can make you an outcast from God." She grew so faint that her hold of him relaxed. He looked up affrighted. He brought her water. He threw it over her, in his terror at the notion that she was going to die and leave him. He called her by every fond name, imploring her to open her eyes. When she partially recovered, he helped her to the bed, on which she lay still, wan, and deathlike. She almost hoped the swoon that hung around her might be death, and in that imagination she opened her eyes to take a last look at her boy. She saw him pale and terror-stricken, and pity for his affright roused her, and made her forget herself in the wish that he should not see her death, if she were indeed dying. "Go to Aunt Faith," whispered she. "I am weary and want sleep." Leonard arose slowly and reluctantly. She tried to smile upon him, that what she thought would be her last look might dwell in his remembrance as tender and strong. She watched him to the door. She saw him hesitate, and return to her. He came back to her, and said in a timid, apprehensive tone, "Mother, will they speak to me about it?" Ruth closed her eyes, that they might not express the agony she felt, like a sharp knife, at this question. Leonard had asked it with a child's desire of avoiding painful and mysterious topics, for no personal sense of shame as she understood it, shame beginning thus early, thus instantaneously. "No," she replied, "you may be sure they will not." So he went, but now she would have been thankful for the unconsciousness of fainting. That one little speech bore so much meaning to her hot, irritable brain. Mr and Miss Benson, all in their house, would never speak to the boy, but in his home alone would he be safe from what he had already learned to dread. Every form in which shame and opprobrium could overwhelm her darling haunted her. She had been exercising strong self-control for his sake ever since she had met him at the house door. There was now a reaction. His presence had kept her mind on its perfect balance. When that was withdrawn, the effect of the strain of power was felt, and athwart the fever mists that arose to obscure her judgment, all sorts of will-o'-wisp plans flitted before her, tempting her to this and that course of action, to anything rather than patient endurance, to relieve her present state of misery by some sudden spasmodic effort that took the semblance of being wise and right. Gradually, all her desires, all her longing, settled themselves on one point. What had she done, what could she do, to Leonard but evil? If she were away, and gone nowhere knew where, lost in mystery, as if she were dead, perhaps the cruel hearts might relent and show pity on Leonard, while her perpetual presence would but call up the remembrance of his birth. Thus she reasoned in her hot dull brain, and shaped her plans in accordance. Leonard stole downstairs noiselessly. He listened to find some quiet place where he could hide himself. The house was very still. Miss Benson thought the proposed expedition had taken place, and never dreamed but that Ruth and Leonard were on distant sunny Scarside Hill, and after a very early dinner she had set out to drink tea with a farmer's wife who lived in the country 2 or 3 miles off. Mr Benson meant to have gone with her, but while they were at dinner he had received an unusually authoritative note from Mr Bradshaw desiring to speak with him, so he went to that gentleman's house instead. Sally was busy in her kitchen, making a great noise, not unlike a groom rubbing down a horse, over her cleaning. Leonard stole into the sitting room, and crouched behind the large old-fashioned sofa to ease his sore aching heart by crying with all the prodigal waste and abandonment of childhood. Mr Benson was shown into Mr Bradshaw's own particular room. The latter gentleman was walking up and down, and it was easy to perceive that something had occurred to chafe him to great anger. "Sit down, sir," said he to Mr Benson, nodding to a chair. Mr Benson sat down, but Mr Bradshaw continued his walk for a few minutes longer without speaking. Then he stopped abruptly, right in front of Mr Benson, and in a voice which he tried to render calm, but which trembled with passion, with a face glowing purple as he thought of his wrongs, and real wrongs they were, he began: "Mr Benson, I have sent for you to ask. I am almost too indignant at the bare suspicion to speak as becomes me. But did you I really shall be obliged to beg your pardon if you are as much in the dark as I was yesterday as to the character of the woman who lives under your roof." There was no answer from Mr Benson. Mr Bradshaw looked at him very earnestly. His eyes were fixed on the ground. He made no inquiry. He uttered no expression of wonder or dismay. Mr Bradshaw ground his foot on the floor with gathering rage, but just as he was about to speak, Mr Benson rose up, a poor deformed old man, before the stern and portly figure that was swelling and panting with passion. "Hear me, sir," stretching out his hand as if to avert the words which were impending. "Nothing you can say can upbraid me like my own conscience. No degradation you can inflict by word or deed can come up to the degradation I have suffered for years at being a party to a deceit, even for a good end." "For a good end! Nay, what next?" The taunting contempt with which Mr Bradshaw spoke these words almost surprised himself by what he imagined must be its successful power of withering; but in spite of it, Mr Benson lifted his grave eyes to Mr Bradshaw's countenance, and repeated, "For a good end." The end was not, as perhaps you consider it to have been, to obtain her admission into your family, nor yet to put her in the way of gaining her livelihood. My sister and I would willingly have shared what we have with her. It was our intention to do so at first, if not for any length of time, at least as long as her health might require it. Why I advise perhaps I only yielded to advice a change of name, an assumption of a false state of widowhood, was because I earnestly desired to place her in circumstances in which she might work out her self-redemption; and you, sir, know how terribly the world goes against all such as have sinned as Ruth